Before Europe could wake, it heard drums, not the polished brass of parades, not the rumble of tanks. Drums, boots striking frozen earth in rhythm, breath cutting through the white air of dawn. Dark silhouettes moving through smoke as villages burned behind them. The first thing they saw wasn't armor, it was faces, black faces, steady, unflinching. Advancing through the frost of a European winter that had been promised to belong to someone else. Whispers slipped through shattered windows. Who are they? Where did they come from? Because in towns fed on stories of African weakness, this sight did not fit the script. These were not servants, not dockworkers. Not shadows in the background of empire. They were soldiers, rifles raised, boots crunching over barbed wire, eyes locked on bunkers stamped with the iron symbol of the Nazi Party. And here's the part no one ever told you. Some of those men came from villages under French rule, from Senegal, from Chad, from Morocco. Men recruited into units like the Senegalese Tirailleurs, told they were subjects, not citizens. Yet on this morning, they were the tip of the spear. Nazi officers watched through binoculars, confusion tightening their jaws. Propaganda had promised racial superiority, had painted Africa as primitive, powerless. But now, African soldiers were storming their trenches. Gunfire cracked the air. Snow exploded under mortar shells. A young private, barely 20, whispered to himself as he ran, "Let today mean something," because he knew the truth. He was fighting for a Europe that would celebrate victory, but might not invite him to the celebration. That's the cruelty buried beneath the heroism. These men were asked to die for freedom, while their own homelands remained colonized. They charged anyway, through machine gun fire, through minefields, through the suffocating smoke of bunkers that fell one by one. And when the flags were raised over liberated towns, villagers stared in disbelief. Black hands had pulled down the swastika. Black blood had soaked into European soil. What he discovered next, what Europe discovered next, changed everything. Victory does not care about skin. Courage does not bow to propaganda. Yet after the war, medals were handed out unevenly. Pay was delayed. Recognition diluted. Some of these veterans returned home to colonies still under foreign rule. Uniform folded. Sacrifice half acknowledged. History, it seems, can be selective, but listen closely. Every time we speak about the fall of Hitler, every time we honor the liberation of occupied Europe, their footsteps echo beneath the story. They were not symbols. They were sons, fathers. Dreamers who believed that if they fought fascism abroad, maybe one day freedom would find them at home. So ask yourself, when Europe heard those drums from the South, did it only hear liberation? Or did it hear a warning that the myth of superiority was cracking, that empire's contradictions were marching in plain sight? Because these men weren't just fighting Hitler. They were fighting a lie, and the sound of their boots across frozen ground still hasn't stopped echoing. Before the world called them heroes, it called them subjects. Africa was carved like meat on a banquet table, lines drawn in ink by men who had never touched its soil. France, Britain, Belgium, empires planted flags, extracted gold, harvested rubber. Collected taxes in languages not born on African tongues. And in cities like Dakar and Lagos, boys grew into men under foreign anthems. They learned European history, European grammar, European obedience. But here's the part no one warned them about. In 1939, Europe caught fire. When Adolf Hitler marched his armies across borders, the same empires that ruled Africa began to tremble. France braced, Britain prepared for invasion, and suddenly the colonies mattered. Recruitment posters bloomed across West and North Africa, ink still wet, promises even wetter. Serve the empire, defend civilization, earn honor. Young men stood in dusty squares staring at those words. Some needed the pay, some chased adventure. Some believed, truly believed, that loyalty would be rewarded. One recruit folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He whispered, "Maybe this is how they see us." Thousands answered the call. They joined units like the Senegalese Tirailleurs, though many were not Senegalese at all, farmers from Mali, laborers from Guinea, students from Ivory Coast. They boarded ships bound for a continent they had only seen in textbooks. Salt air stung their faces. Waves slammed against steel hulls. Below deck, the smell of oil and sweat mixed with nervous hope. They imagined parades, medals, respect. What they discovered next changed everything. Europe was not marble statues and polite applause. It was smoke, sirens, children crying in bomb shelters, and waiting for them was an enemy who had built an ideology on racial hierarchy. The soldiers of the Nazi Party did not see fellow warriors. They saw targets. They saw propaganda made flesh. Captured African troops were sometimes executed on the spot. Uniforms did not protect them from hatred. Imagine standing in a trench, snow soaking through boots you never worn before, knowing the man across the field believes you are less than human. One private tightened his grip on his rifle. His breath trembled in the cold. "I'll show them," he muttered under gunfire, because this war was no longer just Europe's war. It was a collision of ideologies. On one side, empire preaching civilization while practicing domination. On the other, Nazism screaming superiority without shame. And in between, African soldiers. Fighting for nations that denied them equality, facing enemies who denied them humanity. Something was about to break, not just front lines, not just armies, beliefs. Because when black soldiers charged across European battlefields, when their blood darkened French soil, when they stood their ground under artillery fire, the myth of racial superiority cracked. And here's the question history still wrestles with. What happens when men treated as subjects become the defenders of the so-called civilized world? The answer didn't just shake battlefields. It planted seeds, seeds of resistance, seeds of independence, seeds that would one day rise against the very empires they had defended. The world never expected them. But once they arrived, nothing, not even ideology, would remain untouched. They gave them uniforms and sent them into fire. Wool coats stiff against European cold, boots too tight. Rifles cold as iron judgment. In training camps across France, African recruits stood in perfect lines, breath fogging the air, drums replaced by bugles, dust replaced by frost. Some learned artillery, hands blackened by gunpowder. Others became sharpshooters, eyes steady, heartbeat slow. For the first time, many felt it, pride. A private ran his fingers over the buttons of his coat and whispered, "Now they will see." But here's the part no one prepared them for. In 1940, when Germany invaded, there was no gradual introduction to war. No gentle beginning. They were thrown straight into it. The front lines, the chaos. The screaming metal of artillery tearing open the sky. They fought at the Somme, in the forests of the Ardennes, in villages whose names tangled on their tongues, snow mixed with mud. Mud mixed with blood, and they did not retreat. German field reports written in cold, precise ink described them as disciplined, aggressive, unyielding. Imagine that. Men colonized by Europe, now defending it with a fury Europe did not expect. What they did next changed the tone of the battlefield. When French units buckled under blitzkrieg speed, African regiments held positions longer than ordered. Machine guns rattled through the night. Bayonets flashed in dawn light. One sergeant shouted over the thunder, "Stand, stand!" And they stood. For a brief electric moment, destiny felt close enough to touch, as if courage could rewrite hierarchy, as if valor could dissolve prejudice. But proving your worth to a racist ideology is a dangerous game, because the soldiers of the Nazi Party were not just fighting a war, they were defending a myth. A myth that declared black men inferior, subhuman, unworthy of uniform. So when African troops resisted fiercely, when they inflicted casualties, when they refused to break, it wasn't just military opposition, it was ideological defiance. And defiance to a regime built on racial supremacy demanded punishment. Captured African soldiers were separated from white prisoners, mocked, sometimes executed. The crack of rifles echoed in lonely fields. No medals, no witnesses, only silence swallowing the truth. One young fighter, hands bound, lifted his chin before the shot. In his mind, a final thought, "If I fall, let it mean something." This was the cruel paradox. They wore the uniform of a republic that preached liberty, while facing an enemy that denied their humanity, all while belonging fully to neither. And yet, they fought, not for Hitler. Not even fully for France, but for dignity, for the chance to stand in history not as subjects, but as equals under fire. The march into fire was not just about territory, it was about visibility. Because every trench they held, every counterattack they launched, every frozen battlefield where they refused to kneel, cracked something larger than a front line. It cracked the illusion that courage has a color. They surrendered and were shot anyway. No warning, no mercy, just the click of rifle bolts sliding into place. When France fell in 1940, chaos swallowed its armies. Columns of smoke clawed at the sky. Boots pounded down broken roads. Among the captured were thousands of African soldiers. But this was not ordinary captivity. Under the racial doctrine of the Nazi Party, black men in uniform were not legitimate combatants. They were labeled subhuman, and ideology pulled the trigger. Entire units of the Senegalese Tirailleurs were lined up after surrendering. Hands raised, weapons down. In fields near Chasselet, the summer air was thick, cicadas humming. Grass bending in the breeze, then gunfire. Bodies fell into European soil not in battle, but in execution. Imagine surviving artillery, surviving bayonets. Only to be killed after saying, "I surrender." One soldier, according to witnesses, stood tall even as rifles aimed at his chest. He whispered, "Tell my mother I stood." But here's what most textbooks skip. Some escaped, some refused to disappear. While the Vichy regime cooperated, others answered the call of a general broadcasting defiance from exile Charles de Gaulle. Under the banner of the Free French, African troops regrouped, rearmed. Reignited, war had turned personal. They fought in North Africa. Desert winds whipping sand against their faces. They pushed through Italy's mountains, boots slipping on stone. They stormed ashore during the liberation of southern France, waves crashing against landing craft. Every step forward felt like reclaiming stolen dignity. And what they did next changed the map of the war. They helped drive Nazi forces backward, village by village, hill by hill. French civilians cheered as cities were liberated, but looked closer. Even within the Free French ranks, separation lingered. African soldiers were often placed in different camps, paid less, promoted less frequently, liberators abroad, second-class soldiers within. One corporal stared at a metal pin to a white comrade's chest. He touched the empty space on his own uniform and muttered, "Same bullets." Different reward? That contradiction burned hotter than gunpowder. They were good enough to die, good enough to charge machine gun nests, good enough to be photographed in victory parades, until politics demanded otherwise. Because as liberation approached Paris, many African units were quietly replaced in frontline roles. History once again being edited in real time. But their blood was already in the ground, their fingerprints already on the weapons of freedom, and that changes something. Because when a man fights an ideology that calls him less than human, when he survives execution squads, when he returns fire not just for country but for dignity, war is no longer abstract. It becomes identity. So here's the question that lingers long after the gunfire fades. If they were brave enough to help free Europe, they survived Hitler, only to face betrayal at home. Paris erupted in 1944. Church bells clanged wildly. Champagne corks popped like distant gunfire. Crowds flooded the boulevards waving flags, kissing strangers, crying into the night. Paris was free. But look closer. As the cameras flashed, as victory parades marched beneath balconies draped in tricolor, something strange was happening behind the scenes. African troops who had fought through mud, blood, and fire were being quietly removed from the front lines. Reassigned, replaced, reshuffled. But here's the part no one talks about. Photographs were curated, units whitened, the liberation narrative edited in real time. Men who had stormed beaches in southern France, who had pushed through mountains in Italy, who had bled under the same artillery, were suddenly inconvenient to the image of victory. One soldier stood at the edge of a parade route, uniform pressed, medals polished. He watched white units march past roaring crowds. He whispered under his breath, "We were there too." The silence after that thought was louder than any cannon. History was being staged, but the war wasn't finished with them yet. They were shipped back across the sea, back to West Africa, back to colonies still ruled by the same empire they had defended. At the Thiaroye camp in Dakar, returning veterans gathered. The air was thick with dust and expectation. They had fought. They had survived. Now they wanted what they were owed: unpaid wages, equal treatment, basic respect. Nothing more. They waited. They negotiated. They demanded. "What we earned," one veteran insisted. "Nothing extra, just justice." And then the unthinkable. French troops surrounded the camp, rifles raised. The same uniforms these men once wore with pride now aimed directly at them. Gunfire shattered the morning. Men who had faced the armies of Adolf Hitler without flinching fell to bullets fired by the empire they had defended. Dust rose, bodies dropped, cries echoed against the barracks' walls. Victory had come, but justice had not. The massacre at Thiaroye was not just an event, it was a message. Courage on the battlefield did not guarantee equality at home. And here's what changed everything. Survivors carried that memory like a live coal, back to villages, back to families, back into conversations whispered at night. If this is how they treat us after war, what are we fighting for? Seeds were planted that day, seeds of independence, seeds of resistance. Seeds that would grow into movements shaking colonial rule across Africa, because betrayal has consequences. You can erase faces from photographs. You can rearrange parades. You can bury reports in archives, but you cannot erase blood from memory. Today, when we see images of liberated Paris, when we celebrate the fall of fascism, they were buried without headlines. No marble statues, no schoolchildren reciting their names, just earth, cold European earth closing over men who had crossed oceans to defend it. Some graves remain unmarked, wooden posts rotted away. Ink faded from metal tags, and in classrooms across Europe, their stories barely whisper above silence. But here's the truth no soil can swallow. Impact does not need a monument to exist. When the war ended, surviving veterans boarded ships back to West Africa. The ocean wind felt different now, salt against scarred skin, metals clinking softly against their chests. They were not the same men who had left. They had seen empires tremble, seen the supposedly invincible fall, watched the armies of Adolf Hitler collapse into ruin. And somewhere between the trenches and the transport ships, a thought took root. If Europe can bleed, it can be challenged. That realization was more powerful than any rifle. Back in villages near Dakar, across towns stretching toward Bamako, men gathered under baobab trees at dusk. They spoke quietly at first, about unpaid wages, about broken promises, about friends buried in foreign fields, but the conversations changed. They began asking bigger questions. Why fight for freedom abroad if freedom does not live at home? What they discovered next changed the continent. Within years, independence movements surged across West Africa. Rallies filled dusty streets. Newspapers printed bold demands. Voices once trained to salute now learned to protest. The war had taught them strategy, discipline, courage under fire. Now those skills faced a different target, colonial rule. One former soldier folded his uniform carefully and placed it in a wooden chest. He ran his hand over the fabric and whispered, "We learned how to fight, not just with guns, with unity, with memory, with refusal." And slowly, the map of Africa began to shift. Empires weakened, flags lowered. New nations rose from the shadow of old ones. Their graves may be unmarked, but their influence, it pulses beneath the soil of every independent nation that followed. Because when men once labeled subjects helped defeat fascism, they shattered something psychological. They proved superiority was a myth, power was not permanent, and fear could be beaten. So when you look at modern Africa, when you see sovereign flags flying over capitals that were once colonial outposts, remember this. The road to independence did not begin only in conference halls or political speeches. It began in trenches, in execution fields, in forgotten camps. It began with men who crossed oceans, faced hatred, survived betrayal, and came home changed. The world tried to forget their names. But every nation born from colonial chains carries their echo. And maybe the most powerful revolutions, the war ended, but the silence didn't. Decades passed before stone began to rise over forgotten graves, before names were carved where grass once swallowed memory. In towns across France, in quiet corners of Senegal, memorials now stand. Wreaths are laid, bugles play, apologies are whispered into microphones, but here's the uncomfortable truth. Memory is fragile, it bends, it edits, it forgets. The story of African fighters crossing oceans to defeat the armies of Adolf Hitler is still, for many, a footnote, a paragraph between larger headlines, yet those men were not small. They were farmers who became artillerymen, students who became snipers, sons who became symbols. One veteran, standing at a ceremony late in life, touched the edge of a newly built monument. His fingers trembled, he whispered, "It took you long enough." And in that whisper lived both pride and pain, because recognition decades later does not erase execution fields. It does not erase the gunfire at Thiaroye. It does not rewrite photographs carefully staged to exclude darker faces. But it does something else. It forces a mirror into history's hands. Who gets remembered as a liberator? Who gets painted at the center of the canvas? And who is pushed to the margins? That question is not trapped in the 1940s. It breathes today. Every time a textbook condenses their sacrifice into a line, every time a film forgets their presence on European soil, every time we say Allied forces without seeing their faces, the reckoning remains unfinished. But here's the part that matters most. Their greatest invasion was not military, it was psychological. They invaded a continent that had carved Africa into colonies and proved under fire that courage is not owned by empire. They invaded an ideology that ranked human worth by skin and shattered it with discipline and defiance. They forced nations to confront a contradiction. How can you preach liberty while practicing exclusion? And that confrontation did not end with World War II. It echoed into independence movements, into civil rights struggles, into ongoing debates about whose stories deserve the spotlight. Listen closely. When you hear about the liberation of Paris, when you see black and white footage of tanks rolling through cheering crowds, imagine the footsteps just outside the frame. Boots dusted with African soil, eyes that had seen both fascism and betrayal. They crossed oceans to fight tyranny. They shattered myths with courage. And maybe the real victory was not just the fall of a dictator, but the crack they left in the foundation of racial supremacy itself. The world is still catching up to that truth.